What do backers of Brazil's January 6th inspired ransacking of their capital actually stand for? Jair Bolsonaro's backers were inspired by the 2021 storming of the U.S. Capitol by Donald Trump supporters. In both cases, it started with unbacked claims of election fraud long before the vote and ended, well, as we see, in violence. We'll ask about Bolsonaro's successor vowing to pursue those who financed last Sunday's riots and a movement that, once again, organized over social media which thrives on tribalism and outrage. Are populists applying the old Facebook mantra, move fast and break things? Is insurrection the means to an end, an agenda for some kind of new ideology, or is it all just performance politics? That leaves democracies with a lasting problem. How to deal with a small but highly energized minority whose leaders warned long before that if they lose, they'll reject the rules. In the case of Brazil, its new president must strike deals with a sizable chunk of citizens who reject him, and this to isolate the few that are hell-bent on violence. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Brazil's January 6th moment. Joining us from Campinas, that's north of Sao Paulo, he campaigned for Lula, Pedro Rossi, associate professor at the Institute of Economics of the University of Campinas. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
From Rio de Janeiro, France 24 correspondent Tim Vickery. Welcome back, sir.
Lovely to be here.
Brazilian documentary filmmaker Felipe Galvão is with us as well. You spoke with many of those Bolsonaro supporters, and I guess you could say in the build-up to what we've just seen unfold. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much.
Catherine Fieschi is the author of Populocracy, The Tyranny of Authenticity and the Rise of Populism. Nice to see you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. When it comes to the rioters, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, for now, has the backing of an opposition-led Congress. But Lula knows he was elected by a narrow margin. That makes for a brittle grace period now after what we saw unfold in Brasilia. Vedika Bell has more.
His administration may be just over a week old, but Brazil's President Lula is bracing for further anti-government protests. Meeting with the country's lawmakers on Wednesday, he called for a crackdown on anyone involved.
I wouldn't like to think that what happened here was an attempted coup. I want to believe it was a group of crazy people who still don't understand that the election is over. Any gesture that contradicts or is against Brazil's democracy will be punished within the limits of the law.
The concerns have prompted security measures to be ramped up in the capital after the Senate approved military forces to intervene if necessary. Over 1,200 pro-Bolsonaro supporters have been formally arrested and charged in connection to the riots that stormed Brazil's highest offices of power as they called for an overturning of last October's election result. The country's Supreme Court justice has echoed the president's calls for punishment.
I'm absolutely sure that the institutions will punish all those responsible, all those who carried out the acts, those who planned the acts, those who financed the acts, and those who encouraged them by action or omission, because democracy will prevail.
Authorities continue to investigate the mass protests as questions remain around those who may have worked in coordination with the rioters.
Tim Vickery, there was a long period between the election of Lula and Inauguration Day, January the 1st. In that period, we saw these camps of protesters in the capital. Did you expect that it would lead to this?
Everyone was braced for a Brazilian-style January the 6th. It's one of the least surprising surprises. There's an element in this Bolsonaro movement of almost like a death cult. You wonder what these people really want. What do you genuinely want? What are you prepared to die for? And there's an element that loves chaos. There's an element that sees chaos as almost divine. They're involved in a divine fight to save Brazil from the clutches of what they bizarrely see as communism. It's a strange movement, the Bolsonaro movement, because Bolsonaro himself is a figurehead. He's a symbol. I don't think he's ever really had a plan for governance. He's not Mussolini. But in no way is this man an intellectual, which is part of his appeal to many. There's an intellectual laziness, not having to deal with the world, not having to deal with the changes of modernity. And there are huge swathes of people who've projected their own fantasies onto him, from pure opportunists, many of whom have deserted him, to many in the evangelical churches, to extreme small state neoliberals, to pro-dictatorship authoritarians, sectors of agro-business, those who want to develop the Amazon, and social conservatives. And most of these people that we're seeing here, the foot soldiers, are the social conservatives. It's a mixture here, I think, of intense social conservatism plus modern technology, semi-feudalism with a smartphone, if you like. They've been waiting there outside that camp, calling on the military for so long. You knew that this energy was going to be unleashed someday, and it happened on January the 8th.
Happened on January the 8th. By the way, we reached out to supporters of Jair Bolsonaro who declined to take part in our conversation. Felipe Galvão, you heard Tim Vickery wondering aloud about what these people stand for. When you went and visited those camps, what did they tell you? What are they about?
Everything we can imagine, like communist complotism, conspiracy theories like the new order of the world, the new global order. You have something like demands, conservative demands, very simple, against women's rights, against homosexual rights. You have it all, but what I saw and what remains in my head, in my mind, it's the anti-system speech.
Let's take a look at a short clip of some of the images that you filmed. Let's and show those images. Maybe tell us where you filmed these.
In Rio de Janeiro, it was near Christmas, and there was not a lot of people. But during the day, they came. And by the end of the day, there were like 300 people in a period of vacations in Brazil. And there was a lot of structure, caravans, some toilets, security. Part of them were ex-military people, so that assured the security of this camp.
So who organized all this?
That's the question. I think that's the main question the Lula government have to discover, because there are rumors about agribusiness relationships, agribusiness financiers behind this. But there are rumors, for instance, for the moment. But I have to say that I'm very surprised, like Tim, that nothing was nothing was previewed. That's to say, I was there and the guy said to me, I'm not allowed to talk about it, but something is going to happen. I can't speak about it, but something is going to happen. And he said it to me, but he can say to anybody. And how the government that were taking place, the Lula government, didn't see it coming.
Didn't see it coming. Pedro Rossi, why didn't they see it coming?
Yes, this is the big question, I think. I think this happened in Brazil in a way that we couldn't expect. This word anti-system is very important because they went to Brasilia, and this is very different from the capital's riot, because they went to Brasilia on a weekend. You don't make a revolution on a weekend. There was no one there. The destruction was the destruction of the symbols. They didn't destruct the real power. Then on the next day, the real power was there. Lula was there. Lula united the governors, united the leaders of each power of the republic. He walked from the palace, the Palácio de Planalto, which is the presidential palace, to the Supreme Court. So he made a very strong image of power. And they were there to do the destruction of the symbols because they are not strong enough to stage a coup. This is the reality. And I think in a political point of view, Bolsonaro is weaker now and Lula is stronger. Bolsonaro's image is associated to destruction.
And Bolsonaro's image associated to destruction. And I just want to show a clip here because emotions ran high on Tuesday when the Supreme Court Justice Gilmar Mendes returned to his ransacked chambers. Judges have been in Bolsonaro's crosshairs with unfounded claims that it's they, not the voters, who decided the outcome of the election. When pressed by journalists, Mendes, well, he had to suppress tears.
Sem palavras. Sem palavras. Como que chegamos a esse ponto? Temos que fazer tudo para evitar que isso nunca mais se repita. Obrigado.
Pedro Rossi, you were in Brasilia.
Yes, I was there the day after. I was on Monday. So it was an unusual day. So there was some roads that were closed. Of course, the square of the Free Powers, which is where everything happened, was closed. But I walked to the Ministry of Economy and everything. People were working and the government, the real power was there. So that was the point. And the thing here, I think this would never happen in a normal case in Brazil because those places are very secure places. So what happened here, it's that authority in Brazil didn't work. Brazil is a federation of states. So it's not the federal government that is responsible for the security of the normal security of every day. It's the governor of Brasilia. So this was the problem. So the problem now, right now in Brazil, is to see who is with Bolsonaro in the army, who is with Bolsonaro in the several states of the federation, and to go against them with the power of justice.
Yeah, Catherine Fieschi, with the January 6th riots, you had a big security lapse because Washington, D.C. is not a state, and this is kind of this gray area where the Capitol Police, it's a federal entity, which is basically a rare example of a federal police force. And here in Brazil, same thing, the sort of confusion as to who is in charge of what when it comes to this. Is it that, or is there a plot? Is there within the state?
You mean in Brazil?
Yes.
I mean, I think that there's a couple of relevant things. One thing that's really important, and that is one of the major differences, I think, between these two riots, is that, the people in Brasilia were not armed. Right? I mean,
nobody was killed on the day. That's another big difference.
Nobody was killed on the day. These people didn't carry arms. You really had a very different kind of crowd. Also, this crowd had been there for weeks. You made a reference to, move fast and break things. Well, they broke things, but they didn't move particularly fast. I mean, they sat around for quite a while. So I think that's a really important difference in terms of the actual threat that was being leveled at the Capitol versus the threat that was being leveled in Brazil.
Are you suggesting they lulled authorities into a sense of, this isn't going to go anywhere?
Well, I mean, there are records essentially of, police officers reassuring, other authorities and saying, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. There's nothing happening here. It's all very peaceful and so on and so forth. So, there is a question mark over whether or not, these forces of law and order were complicit with a lot of these rioters. I just want to make one quick point on the anti-system nature of the protest, because I think this is really important. And I think it's true, we're dealing with, certainly in terms of Bolsonaro himself, an authoritarian populist, ultra-conservative, possibly quite racist, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, this is not just people who are anti-system, and they were galvanized toward taking power against a very specific system. These are the symbols of a specific system, which is representative democracy. And it is a deep rejection, I think, on the part of Bolsonaro himself, the fact that he didn't even want to be there, during the switching of power, and a deep rejection that he's cultivating in his supporters in everything that has to do with representative democracy, from the peaceful transfer of power to checks and balances to, in fact, the very buildings and the institutions that hold the symbols of representative democracy in Brazil. So it's a very targeted attack. It's anti-system, absolutely, but it's anti a specific system.
Anti a specific system, and I want to get back to that point because it's important as to what this all means. But I'm haunted by what Felipe said about the warning signs on the wall. And just as the January 6th movement caught authorities in Washington off guard, last Sunday's riots in Brasilia surprised authorities, even though organizers used VPN and code words on social media, inviting followers to what they called Selma's party. It's going to be huge, says this post. And there you see how to get to that main esplanade in the capital. Just remind us, why Selma's party?
Yeah, Selma, I think that's a code for selva. That is, it means jungle in Portuguese, and it's a cry of war in the Brazilian army. So it's a cry war. They are in a war.
So you heard earlier Tim Vickery talking about how they are thinking maybe primal, but they're tech savvy, these people. Your thoughts on the fact that they're able to organize?
They are able to organize. They were bussed in. Be interesting to see exactly who financed those buses. Nobody seems to know right now who financed them. So they are organized. I think they gave themselves quite a while to organize. I mean, Bolsonaro started accusing, essentially evoking potential election fraud a full year before the elections, right? So, I mean, I think, he gave them ample time to start to organize. We know that WhatsApp was, instrumental in organizing. But I have to say that, yes, they were tech savvy, but this wasn't terribly sophisticated, right? The codes were breakable. I mean, this was all completely legible. And as Tim Vickery said, this was a totally unsurprising surprise. No one was caught off guard, and yet somehow nothing was secured. So, I think that there was a lot of performance in this. I think there was a lot of complicitness in this. But having said all that, I do think that, it is symptomatic of a very deep malaise, even if, these people weren't effective in the end.
Pedro Rossi, who's behind it?
Yes, I think it's difficult to say who is behind it. I think Bolsonaro is behind it. But we have to recognize that we have millions of people in Brazil. We have a fascist movement in Brazil that we have to deal with it. I came to the debate a month ago, and I said this, that we're going to get rid of Bolsonaro, but we won't get rid of fascism in Brazil. So we have to deal with it in the next years. So what happened here, there was no doubt what they were capable of. But what we didn't expect, what Lula didn't expect and his minister didn't expect, here is my daughter, I'm sorry, is that the governor of Brasilia would let the supporters of Bolsonaro to go in the square of Free Powers.
Would let them go in. The joys of live television there. An interruption for Pedro Rossi. Tim Vickery, again, we're wondering here who paid for these buses and the porta toilets that Felipe was talking about, and this sort of thing. who did finance it? Because Lula says he wants to go after those people.
Yeah, unluckily my stepdaughters are in their mid-30s, so we're not going to have the same type of, we'll have a different type of interruption, but not exactly the same one. Well, I gave a rundown of elements of the Bolsonaro movements at the start. The evangelical churches is very, very important. Now, this is one of the reasons why the far right in the States looked at Brazil as fertile ground, because they're looking at similarities with the States. And one of those similarities, it's the huge growth of evangelical churches with a kind of rugged, individualist, prosperity type message. And we've seen plenty of evidence of preachers using the pulpit to encourage the activities that we saw on Sunday. So that's a key backer, the evangelical church. I think there are important similarities and differences between Brazil and the United States in terms of the January the 6th, January the 8th one. What Bolsonaro doesn't have is a strong political party behind him to pump out the big lie, to give ballast and credence to the big lie, to the idea that there was fraud in the election. But what he does have is massive support inside the security forces. And what happened here, what we're seeing, it couldn't have happened without a deliberate inefficiency, I think, on the part of some of the security forces.
Tim, we heard Lula this Thursday saying that his defense minister still has his backing. He's not going to sack him. Your thoughts on that, then?
Well, Lula is a conciliator. This is a point which is often lost. When so many times I see the international media describing Lula as leftist. For someone like myself who grew up in Europe pre Mrs. Thatcher, I find it hard to go along with that. He's a conciliator. His first government was very much from the centre left, and this is a broad-based government that he's put. And his defence minister, who said before Sunday that he had friends in these camps, camping outside military barracks, calling for an intervention. It is an attempt for Lula to have some kind of olive branch to make this coalition of his as broad-based as possible. Now, he's clearly following a strategy here of trying to attract as many as possible into his tent and then marginalize the others. Whether it'll be successful is one of the key things of his presidency. It seems to me, I don't know if our illustrious friends agree, that ever since 2008, ever since the financial crisis, an element of the far right have retreated into a fantasy world of wishful thinking, backed up and continually reinforced by social media. And we saw that clearly here in Brazil with COVID. There was the idea that COVID doesn't exist. In fact, the ideological mentor of the Bolsonaro movement, a philosopher who lived in the United States, Brazilian, but lived in the United States, Olavo de Carvalho, he said that COVID was a hoax. It was just an invention, part of Project Fear. What did he die of in the end? Well, he died of COVID. But all along, you saw wishful thinking. We don't want COVID to exist, therefore it doesn't exist. We don't want to lose the election, therefore we haven't lost the election. And how Lula will deal with this rump of the far right who are in denial of reality, I think is one of his most difficult tasks.
Is it millions, as Pedro Rossi was saying? Millions of people? I'm putting it to you, Felipe Galvão.
I can't say millions. I think...
Because 48% of the population voted against Lula. Does 48%?
49%.
49%, excuse me.
58 million people.
But we know that in that 49%, they're not all Bolsonaro supporters, far from it.
Yeah, they are essentially anti-Lula.
Right.
You know, but Bolsonaro incarnates the anti-Lula. As Tim said in his great analysis, Lula is a conciliator. Bolsonaro is a revolutionary leader.
A disruptor? Or a revolutionary?
A revolutionary, I think, because he's not there to build something. He's there to destroy something, to reverse some system. And I think that's important to know because it's the key for the next 4 years, and Lula has to be ready to distract the other. I think this is ideology that is very profound.
Okay, so let me ask you then: when you see the way since the election of Joe Biden, there's been these congressional committees, the Justice Department has advanced slowly.
Yeah.
There have been no charges, no criminal charges filed yet against Donald Trump pertaining directly to January the 6th. Is that the playbook for handling what just happened on the Brazilian side?
It's one of the things, but I think that there is a
Should they be proceeding with such caution?
Not only justice, not only the justice. I think that the juridical response. I think that there is a narrative war, and that it Tim said, the evangelical churches, they are the key. You have some at one side you have these evangelical churches that claim this conservative war. This conservative revolution that Steve Bannon...
A culture war.
Yeah, that Steve Bannon, we have to say this name, is claiming.
Let's talk about Steve Bannon.
Okay, after.
Among the biggest fans of the Brasilia riots, Donald Trump's former close confidant, who, this was while the ransacking was unfolding, hailed them as, quote, Brazilian freedom fighters. This is on the social app Getter. On Wednesday, Bannon was still peddling the conspiracy theory that Brazil's electronic voting machines were suspect, suggesting they be handed over to Brazil's military, saying, he said, quote, he pointed to an article from The Guardian, saying the heart of the matter is the machines. Release the machines to the military so they can complete their audit. Why are Brazilians talking about Steve Bannon? I mean, how much influence do these Americans have on Brazilians?
The American dream, I think, it's one of the key things to comprehend Brazil. Brazil is entirely constructed in all his history based on the American Constitution and American Republic. We once was called the United States of Brazil. That's how Brazilian Republic was born, and I think that it's how to say a mirror to Brazil, and in all the ways. So Steve Bannon, perhaps he's not there, but he's very clever. He gathers all the disenchantment, all these signs, and he puts it in a systematic ideology, and he sells it like I think they are constructing, building an international of far right and far right international.
A far right international. So we've spent part of the show denouncing conspiracy theorists. Catherine, let me ask you: when you see the images like the one back in I think it was 2018 or 19. Of when Jair Bolsonaro went to the White House, and there you see his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, very close to Steve Bannon. Is there an international cabal, an internationale of the far right, of populists?
Well, I think it's emerging. I mean, for a long time, one of the things that stood in the way of the emergence of this cabal was that in the end, all these far right people are nationalists, right? So when they have to get together and agree on something, they're all, pulling everything toward themselves and protecting their nationalist vision. I think this is changing. I think Orban in Europe has done a lot. Hungary's prime minister has done a lot to change this. I think, the links between Bannon, Orban, but also the invitations, recently of Bolsonaro's son, to Budapest. The links are being created and the funding is circulating. I think,
who's funding it? Who's funding it?
Well, there are various groups, in the United States that are sort of, bypassing Russia now, using Budapest and Hungary a little bit more. This is, very dark stuff, and actually it's buried further deep in the net than WhatsApp.
Because we saw in 2016, many of those who were in early on backing Donald Trump were these entrepreneurs whose agenda effectively was to pay less taxes, wasn't it?
There's an awful lot of this which is about paying less taxes, and it is in a sense a kind of libertarian American dream, right? It's a frontier dream, which is why it works so well, I think, when you apply it to Brazil. And I think that one of the things that's animating many of the Bolsonaro supporters, it is in part wishful thinking, but it is in part also this conviction that something is being hijacked from them, right? This dream is being hijacked by a left that they have completely demonized, which, they see, in much the same way that, somebody like Medvedev or Putin, sees, the left in the rest of the world as kind of degenerate and hijacking the potential of Brazil. And I think a lot of this is what we're seeing. And those conspiracy theories actually work very well on this idea that, it's not that they just don't want to believe it, is that they actually feel that their own reality is being, wiped away from them, from right under their nose. The potential of a different Brazil that isn't the left and isn't Lula and isn't these representative institutions. And I just want to say, one more thing on this, which is that, even though this so-called insurrection was in many ways unsuccessful, depending on what it is that they were really trying to achieve, the fact is that I think, a lot of this, and, this is a Brazilian analysis of it, not rather than my own, a lot of this was motivated by the idea that if there was enough chaos, the army would intervene. And this dream of a return of the army, center stage.
Which was in power as late as the 1980s.
Until 1985, right? A return of this, of the army at the heart of Brazilian politics is part of what is fueling this movement and is fueling the Bolsonaro supporters.
So Pedro Rossi, if you're whispering into Lula's ear, how do you do, I guess we could call this counterinsurgency here? Do you try to convince those who attend those evangelical churches? What do you say to the military? How do you go about it?
Yes, it's a very challenging task, and I think the most ready to do this is Lula. He's a conciliator. I agree with this. I disagree with some points of Felipe. I do agree with a lot of his analysis, but I think Bolsonaro is not a revolutionary. He's a reactionary. He wants to go back, as Catherine said, he wants to go back to a dictatorship. He wants to deny the rights, the human rights that we have in Brazil since the 88 Constitution. He wants to stop the advance of the women's movements, the black people's movement. So Bolsonaro is a reactionary. This destruction, what they did here in Brasilia, it's what Bolsonaro did in the government. He wants to just destruct the government as he is. So Bolsonaro, it's a very peculiar phenomenon. And I think what Lula is doing right now is to try to move slowly. When we see his minister, which is a conservative guy, saying that he has friends in the camps, the minister is sending a message to the military forces that saying, I am like you guys, so let's talk. Let's try to move things forward. So this is the way that I think Lula will go. And as I said, I think we have some years to deal with this fascist movement. Hopefully, I don't think they are strong enough for a coup. And I think Lula will be strong to deal with this, and the justice departments in Brazil will deal with this, what happened in Brazil right now.
Ever since January the 6th, 2021, over in the United States, they've been treading cautiously as to how to handle Donald Trump. Brazil may be facing weeks, months, years of having the same conversation about Jair Bolsonaro. He's now left hospital. He'd been suffering abdominal pain. He left Brazil just before the January 1st inauguration for a gated community in the suburbs of Orlando, Florida. After last Sunday's riots, U.S. lawmakers like progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for his extradition. The U.S. president, along with his Canadian and Mexican counterparts, strongly condemning the storming of the Brazilian capital. The Biden administration, which says its phone lines to Lula are open.
I'm not aware of an official request for information or extradition from the Brazilian government. Though, of course, if we were to receive one, we treat it seriously and examine it carefully, as we generally do for such requests.
Tim Vickery, does Lula want Bolsonaro back?
It's a good question. Now, Lula has set an interesting bar here in the way that he played within the system with his own legal problems. Remember, he went to prison on an extraordinary weak case, charged by someone who immediately afterwards stopped being a judge and became a right-wing politician, and has been a supporter of Bolsonaro. Lula played within the system. He accepted this. He went to prison. He could have fled the country. He could have taken asylum in a foreign embassy. Didn't do any of those things. So he set a very high bar there for Bolsonaro. And I think we've seen enough to know that Bolsonaro is not a good faith actor. Let's remember, on the Friday before the election, October the 30th on Sunday, Bolsonaro was adamant. He was saying, whoever has the most votes will win the election. No problem. If I lose, I'll just go home quietly. We haven't seen any of that. He's not a good faith actor. And so I think I think it's absolutely essential that the law be brought against him without revenge, with full opportunities of defence. There are other things that need to be looked into, not only his government's response to COVID, but also the fact that we know that over the years, the Bolsonaro clan acquired 51 apartments, either wholly or partially in cash. Now, that in itself is not a crime, but it does tend to look suspicious. These things have to be looked into. The Lula government is releasing details of Bolsonaro's spending while president. It'll be interesting to see the reaction of all of those things in potential supporters. So far, millions of his supporters have been absolutely untouched by accusations against him. This so-called paragon of family values, who through his life has continually swapped his wife for a younger model, and during the election campaign said, in his own words, that he was involved in a climate of sexual tension with a 14-year-old girl. Still, his supporters refuse to desert him. They will take a lot of deserting. They are living in their own alternative reality. But in order to separate him from the most I think the most extreme can be separated from the rest. We even saw that on election night, where some Bolsonaro supporters, once it was obvious that Lula had won, were already shifting. In this sense, Brazilian politics is much more malleable and flexible than politics in the United States. So that is the game that, in my humble opinion, Lula has to play. No amnesty, hard line within the law for Bolsonaro and the leaders, conciliation for the others.
A hard line for Bolsonaro and conciliation for the others. It's a bit of a tightrope, Felipe Galvão. Is Lula up to this task at his advanced age, shall we say?
That's the question I'm asking myself since he declared candidate, because I voted for Lula 20 years ago, and that was one Brazil. This Brazil, for me, I said once, is no longer exists. And Lula now has to face a reactionary evolutionary. I think it's a reactionary revolution that he claims to lead Bolsonaro. And I don't think that for now we are up to this task yet. I hope that Lula can be.
So if Bolsonaro comes back tomorrow, that's bad news for Lula.
Yeah, I think because he can excite every day. 25% of Brazilian people supports them. They are isolated, I know, but once he begins to put fire in the fire, I think that it can be another episode, like we said, like we saw. And I just want to point one thing that we didn't talk about, but is the tradition of Brazil in far right. You know, we don't talk so much about it, but in the 30s, the fascist Brazilian party had 1 million people. 1 million people. So it was the second. I think that the biggest fascist party behind the Nazi party. So how can we look to what's happening now without knowing this? We have 25 years of dictatorship. It was a far-right regime. And the practice of the far-right in the army, they are still there.
Yeah.
So we have to look at Brazil as a conservative society. And that's why Bolsonaro can always, how do I say, grow between people.
Pedro Rossi, very briefly, do you agree that now, as in the next 24 hours or 48 hours, is not the time for Bolsonaro to be returning home?
Yes, I think he went to Florida to avoid justice and to avoid the system, to avoid passing the presidential / to Lula. So he cannot be this kind of guy that just respect the rules. But if he comes back, I think he will have trouble with Brazilian justice. And I don't know if it's good for him. What I know is he's weak now. And Lula is much, much stronger after what happened. This destruction was not good for Bolsonaro. It's a demonstration of power, but not of real power. It's very symbolic. We will remember this for the next years, decades, but it's not the real power that we are talking about.
Catherine Fieschi, if I had $1 for every time people have said since January 6th, oh, Donald Trump is weak. And yeah, even though he didn't perform very well, his candidates in the midterm elections, he's still the front runner, and the future is unwritten as to what happens next year in the United States. Is there a playbook here that we're seeing, and that, we've talked about the U.S. and Brazil, that could be applied elsewhere?
I mean, I think that, one of the major differences to which we've already alluded is the fact that, the Republican Party is, it's tearing itself apart, but nevertheless, it's a strong functioning party that can actually, bring voters back together when they need to. I think what would be interesting, though, is to look at it also from another perspective. There's a strong comparison with the United States, but there's another comparison that needs to be made, and that is with, other countries that have transitioned into democracy over the past 30 years. And so, for me, I think what's interesting, coming forward is, how does, Brazil ensure that, the transition to democracy is completed, that the promises of representative democracy are fulfilled, not just prosperity, but, prosperity and tackling inequality, tackling corruption, which I think, undermines a lot of these promises. And we see that, these are the questions that, many of the Central and East European countries have had to answer and are still struggling to answer. So I think that, these exits from authoritarian rule, into forms of representative democracy in capitalist systems, right, where inequality can rise and therefore create real problems. I think that's the other comparison that we need to make, as well as the comparison with the United States.
We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Much more we could say, and there's obviously much more to unfold with this story. I want to thank you, Catherine Fieschi. I want to thank as well Felipe Galvão, Pedro Rossi for being with us, as well as Tim Vickery. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.